introduce Hanna and tell you how you can come see the exhibition. Oh, recording, where is it? Dan, can you record? I can't see, thank you. And I know that many of you who may be watching this later, and I hope you will join us as well. Hanna Abakunova is a researcher, Dr. Abakunova is a researcher in Romani studies at the Hugo Valentin Center, Uppsala University, Sweden. She is a former researcher at Yad Vashem, at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Dr. Abakunova obtained her PhD in Holocaust history from the University of Sheffield in the UK, and is currently preparing her monograph on self-rescue of Jews and Roma during the Holocaust in Ukraine for publication by Harvard University. She is the co-author of The Genocide and Persecution of the Roma and Sinti, Bibliography and Historiographical Review in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance 2016, and the author of Extermination of the Roma in Transnistria During World War II, Construction of Roma Collective Memory, in Anna Vilegawa and Małgorzata Głowacka Greiper, The Burden of the Past, History, Memory, and Identity in Contemporary Ukraine, published by the Indiana University Press in 2020, amongst others. Abakunova's research interests encompass history and memory of persecution of Jews and Roma during the Holocaust in Ukraine in a comparative perspective, particularly rescue and self-rescue of Roma and Jews and motivation for rescuing Jews by non-Jews, interethnic relations before, during, and after the Holocaust, and construction of memory about the persecution of Roma by the Nazi and Soviet regimes. At our international conference on our campus last summer on Heroines of the Holocaust, New Frameworks of Resistance, Hanna spoke on the role of Ukrainian women in helping and rescuing the Roma and Jews during the Holocaust in Ukraine. I'm delighted to welcome her back. As we shall see, I'm going to allow Hanna to speak about it, but currently in our Spotlight Gallery in our Horrmann Library, we're proud to host an exhibition that Hanna worked on with fellow Ukrainian and Polish scholars, Roots of Disappearance, Jewish and Roma Memory of Transnistria. All are welcome to come and see it and to look at the extensive research and oral history that went into creating this exhibition. It is now my pleasure to introduce Hanna.
Thank you so much, Laura, and I generally want to thank you and Lori and all people who were involved in the organization, installation of the exhibition at Wagner College. It's a great pleasure to have that exhibition there, and also it's very nice, and I'm so grateful for inviting me to talk tonight. And hello, everyone. And everybody, and I will start my talk. I will share my screen. Can you see it, right? And you can hear me as well. Okay, great. I actually didn't know what will be the audience, and I decided to combine some parts of my research with some general knowledge about Ukraine. And again, I don't know how much American audience knows about Ukraine and Transnistria. And then I also will talk about the exhibition. So my presentation, my talk today will consist of three parts. First, I will explain what is Transnistria and give like general details and important details about Transnistria. Then I will tell more about the creation of the exhibition, the idea behind, and what we got. And third, I will try to show some points, not everything, of course, but some points which we could learn out of the exhibition and which I could also insert into my research. And first of all, I would like to give just general data about the destruction of the Jews and the Roma in Ukraine. For those who may not be aware of the events during the Second World War. I want just to point out that on June 22nd, 1941, the German Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet territories, and the first territories where Wehrmacht entered was Western Ukraine and Lviv area. And exactly from the same day, already several Jews were killed by the Wehrmacht, not as Jews, but as communists. The major massacre started in August 27-28, 1941 in Kamenets-Podilsky city. And this was the main massacre in that first phase of the war, from which actually what we now called Holocaust by bullets started. During this massacre, 23,600 Jews were killed, and also there were 70 Roma who were killed at the same area. And here you can see a contemporary map of Ukraine, and the mark where is actually Kamenets-Podilsky. Kamenets-Podilsky was included in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, which was under the German occupation. And how this town looks, these photos I took like 10 years ago. Nothing actually reminds about that massacre which happened there. And now I will tell more about Transnistria. Actually, Ukrainian territory was divided between the Germans and the Romanians, and there were several occupied zones. One of the zones was called officially Transnistria Governorate. And Transnistria actually was an administrative region which was created according to the German-Romanian Treaty, which was signed in summer 1941. With this agreement, the territory which was called Transnistria Governorate was granted to Romania, which at that time was headed by General Ion Antonescu. Again, just to give some geographic frames, where Transnistria was, or actually I said where is Transnistria. Transnistria was formed out of several parts, what is now contemporary Moldova and Ukraine. There were several tiny parts of eastern regions of Moldova, and in a second I will show the map, and also significant territory of Ukraine, which the territory of Ukraine was situated between, the territory of Ukraine, which was Transnistria, was situated between the Dniester and the Southern Bug rivers, or in Ukrainian we called Pivdenny Bug, Southern Bug, and limited in the south by the Black Sea. And it included actually 3 regions or oblasts in Ukrainian: entire Odessa Oblast, including the major city of Odessa, the western and southwestern parts of the Mykolaiv Oblast, but the main city Mykolaiv was not included. And it was in the beginning under the military administrative zone control under the Germans, and later it was included in the Reichskommissariat of Ukraine, again under the Germans. And also major part of Vinnytsia Oblast, except again its northern part and the main city of Vinnytsia, which was included in the Reichskommissariat of Ukraine. Here you can see the yellow part. It's actually what is Transnistria, and you can see in the south Odessa. You also can see 2 rivers, blue lines, Dniester on the left and on the right Southern Bug. And the red line actually shows contemporary border of Moldova. And you see between the blue line and red line, you still can see yellow part, which is tiny parts of contemporary Moldova. And why I emphasize that, because usually talking about Transnistria in public talks and in historiography, I can see that scholars talk mostly about Ukraine, but somehow Moldovan part is omitted. That's why I would like to emphasize that. And another thing that upon the formation of the Transnistria Governorate, the capital city was made in Tiraspol. You see Tiraspol is Moldova area. But in October, there was a major battle for Odessa. And after Odessa was captured, Odessa became the capital of Transnistria until the end of Transnistrian existence. And here I just want to show you the scale of Transnistria. Again, you see the larger part is Ukraine, which is black and empty. And then another part is Moldova, which is smaller, also empty. And red one is Transnistria. And actually, this is the map, which was a ground for one of the slides, one of the charts of our exhibition. Who resided in Transnistria? Again, talking about Transnistria, mostly I can hear about deportations, deported Jews and Roma, but we shouldn't forget that there was also local population, local Jews and Roma who resided in Transnistria, and some of them were not deported. They were gathered into ghettos. Some of them were deported within Transnistrian area. And of course, Jews and Roma deported from southern Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, which were provinces under the Romanian control, and from entire inner part of Romania. Deportations of the Jews started already in October 1941. Actually, in the beginning of the occupation in August 1941, agreement about the administration and exploitation of the region was signed between Germany and Romania. And this agreement already has specified that all Jews, including those who had not yet been transferred across the Bug River, should be used to construct labor camps until the time when they could be transferred to the east. This document can be considered as the main regulation of the deportations of Jews to Transnistria. And after that, as I said, it was signed already in August, but deportations themselves started in early October 1941. Deportations of the Roma started later in May 1942. And also in Transnistria, there were several concentration and labor camps. I will just mention main Domanivka, or in Russian Domanyovka. It's how this name entered to historiography. The same like in Romanian Domanyovka with different spelling. But in contemporary historiography, I will use, and I myself will use, Ukrainian name. Then Bogdanivka, again known as Bogdanovka in Russian, and then Pechora, less known camp, but called among the Jews who were persecuted there, that loop. That means that those who entered there never could go out, and anyway would die. And one of the our chart in the exhibition actually mentions Pechora, and I will come back to this chart later. Just very briefly to mention the numbers. In Transnistria, considering Jews who were deported there and those who were local, actually estimation that between 280,000 and 380,000 were perished. That means depends on the certain location between 50 and 80%. So it means between 50 and 20% could survive, depends on the particular location. In terms of Roma, again, local Roma and deported, estimation is very rough. Over 25,000 were perished, and it means between 40 and 55%. It means between 45 and 60% of Roma could survive in Transnistria. And then just after this brief knowledge, I would move to the exhibition itself. And I would like to mention that the idea of the exhibition actually belongs to Józef Markiewicz, who is currently working in Polin. And at that time, when exhibition was created, we had a project in 2010, 2011, which means like 12 years ago already. Yusuf had this idea to work on Transnistria and try to find specialists. He himself is cultural anthropologist, and he needed historian who would research Jews. And by that time, I didn't research Roma. I didn't know anything about Roma and even didn't consider to include them into my research. But when we got acquainted, we started to think whom else we can involve. And there was Zemfira Kondur, who is currently vice president of the Roma Foundation Chirikli in Kyiv, and working for human rights defense, and particularly Romani women defense. And she also was a part of our team. And Hanna Abakunova, my brother at the time, student in Ukraine, who helped us with some technical issues. And this project was implemented within the program Path of Remembrance undertaken by Geschichtswerkstatt Europa, realized by Institute for Applied History in cooperation with the European University Viadrina. And financially, it was supported by the German foundation Remembrance Responsibility Future. How we came to the idea to what we would like to focus. First of all, we thought about Ukrainian territories and the influence of others, not German, on the territories, who actually persecuted the Jews. And in German allies in occupied Ukraine were Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians. But only Romanians had certain occupied territory. Of course, I should say that some western part of Ukraine, which is called Zakarpattia, was under Hungary already since 1939. But after the invasion of the German army of the Soviet territories, only Romanians had own area within Ukrainian territories. And that's why we focused on Romanians. We tried to find different sources. And first, what we would like to focus is oral history sources. And first of all, of course, interviews with the survivors. At that time, 2010, 11, and even later 12, when I returned to some of the survivors, it was possible to collect interviews. There were still many survivors in good physical conditions and mental conditions who could not only tell us their stories, but also sometimes show us the places. And we collected interviews in Ukraine, in Moldova, and also some of the survivors of Transnistria I found in Israel. And during one of my fellowships, I had an opportunity to meet them and collect interviews from them. Some of the survivors already have told their stories in different events during different times, and they even headed certain organizations. But some of them didn't talk publicly, and even we had several interviews where Jews and Roma stated that they never told anyone about what happened to them. And not only interviews were our interest, but also family archives. Recent years, family archives and family histories became quite popular for researchers, especially in Romani studies. But again, 12 years ago, except major organizations like Yad Vashem or Beit Lochamei Hagetaot, not many organizations really were interested, and particular researchers were not interested in family archives. And survivors also told us that no one ever asked them photographs or some documents, documents, not ID, but some other documents, like, for example, marriage certificates or certificate of birth and so on. Also, we heard from the survivors that generally researchers and also non-governmental organizations were not interested in objects, but we talked about different objects which were related to the Holocaust. And then I discovered that actually there were already several tiny museums, Holocaust museums in several towns, like Mykolaiv city and Vinnytsia city and some others. And those museums were organized just by efforts and by financial support of the survivors or local Jewish communities or Hassids. And those museums preserved not only documents, but also the objects about which I'm talking. And also, we understood that it's not enough only to research, only to collect interviews and research oral history methodology and collect documents, but we worked in regional Ukrainian archives in Kyiv, in Vinnytsia, and in Moldova. And of course, Yad Vashem archives in Israel, which were helpful, and also in the main charts of the exhibition, we used several photographs from Yad Vashem, which were public. And the idea was in the beginning to create the background for the chart. And we thought that it's not so nice just to have blue, white or black background. We wanted to give a background of photographs. I don't know how much it's visible, it depends on the printing quality, but the idea of the background was either some nature of Transnistria, because when we traveled, we photographed a lot of the rivers or the places where people were deported, or streets where actually the events happened. For example, on this photograph, you can see Žmerinka town, and this street is exactly the street. On the one hand, on the left, there was a ghetto where all Jews were collected. On the other hand, there was like free zone and market where Ukrainians lived. And this street was particularly interesting because almost nothing remained from the wartime in that street. But still it exists. And one of the survivors decided to go with me to Žmerinka, even though she lived at that time and for many years in Vinnytsia. And we traveled to Žmerinka, where she just walked and showed all streets, all buildings, where was what. So that was the idea of the background. And then we just made it like white and black, as you see another photograph, and darker, and placed into chart. In some charts are visible, you can see some trees, but in some the quality can be different and can be more blackish or grayish. But still, I would like to point out the idea. And for example, here, if you see between the lines, I don't know, yeah, I can see something not really black, but some grayish, blackish, and some silhouettes. Another idea was to create not maps, but schemes to show some places where people survived or where they were gathered into ghettos. Like, for example, here is the chart about the Roma. And I pointed out here Berezovka or Berezivka in Ukrainian and Ivanovka or Ivanivka in Ukrainian, where those Roma survived in hiding during the occupation. Or here you can see another schematic map of Simeon Dodik, person who survived in Transnistria and escaped to Transnistria from Rice Commissariat of Ukraine. And on the map, you can see all his movements, how he escaped from one place to another and then returned again to the same place, then again learned about the danger and again escaped. And it's quite a history of this person. And the same here, another chart of Sergei Sushon. Also here we showed schematically deportations how he and his family was deported from Odessa and then to Berezivka and then Domanivka and then Semikhatki, Akhmechetka, Viktorovka, all small villages. And some of them already appeared like towns. They grown up into towns like Domanivka, but some of them disappeared at all after the Second World War. What was also interesting that, as you see on this chart, the survivors gave us documents. They gave us family photographs. And for example, in the middle, you can see very tiny photograph of Pixty, where the family was held during several months. This photograph was made by Sergei Sushon when he once in his life returned to that place. After many, many years, when he already lived in Israel with his family, he decided to go and see those places, to check how it looked and to try to understand how it was possible to survive. And for example, other documents, like for example, Odeskaya Gazeta, you see on the top, the order we found in archives and some other photographs. Here you can see two women. One is Romani woman Tamara Tsinya and another Jewish Жанна Хвощан. And I wanted to point out that ordinary people who didn't speak publicly were willing to testify and to give us their stories. For example, returning to the objects, you can see in the hands of Жанна the scarf. And this scarf was actually like magic scarf for the family, because the grandmother gave the scarf to Жанна and her mother when was evacuated. And they preserved this like some magic thing. And Жанна said that thanks to this scarf, we survived, because we always thought that we have to preserve it and return to our grandmother when she will return from the evacuation. And the place where she is standing actually is this tiny museum in Mykolaiv, which was created by the head of the Hesed and Jewish survivors. And some objects like the clocks, the photographs, everything was brought to this museum. And unfortunately, abroad, I mean, outside of Ukraine, not so many scholars and organizations knew about those museums. And when speaking about the Holocaust in Ukraine, somehow there is always impression that there is nothing to show, but such tiny museums exist almost in every city and even towns. However, they don't have financial support to be advertised and have events. And to the left, Tamara Tsinya, Romani woman from Ukrainska Roma. And here I want to clarify that when we talk about Roma and Sinti in Ukraine, we talk about different communities, because there are several different groups and subgroups of Roma, like Kishinyovцы, Servi or Ukrainska Roma, and Vlachi and Lovare and many others. And the major group is Serbi or Ukrainska Roma, how they call themselves. So Tamara is one of them, and the picture was taken in her house where we arrived for interviews. And some other survivors already were quite famous. For example, Semyon Dodik, after surviving the Holocaust, and he lost all his family. And then in 1944, he decided to join partisans. And until the end of the war, he was in partisan movement, Soviet partisans. After the war, he started to research the history of his own town, which is called Bar, very small town in Rice Commissariat of Ukraine. And he wrote his biography. What you can see on the slide is The Fate and Life of the boy from Shad Ghetto. He wrote this biography with some consideration of history, with some historical materials which he found in archives. Another example is Sergei Sushon. Also, his brother Leonid Sushon wrote a book, Transnistria, Jews in the Hell. And you can see on the photograph on the bottom, entire family and two brothers, Leonid and Sergei. Both of them moved to Israel and became heads of their Ghetto Prisoners Association. And on the right side, you see Sergei with the woman who actually helped the family to survive the Holocaust and received the title, the righteous among the nations of the world, from Yad Vashem. Here you again see two different examples, and on the right, Celia Krasner, ordinary woman from who lived in Vinnytsia and at the time of interview, but survived the Holocaust and the ghetto, Tulchin. She was not deported, but family was gathered into ghetto. And what is interesting, ordinary person who actually tried to collect all possible testimonies and witness accounts and sent to Yad Vashem that people who saved the Jews would receive honorary award. And by her own efforts, several people in Vinnytsia and from Transnistria actually got those awards. And on the left, you see Clara Katz, another ordinary woman who actually survived all possible deportations together with her family. I mean, not all members of family survived. And we also have one of their charts in the exhibition about her. And particularly, she mentioned several times about the Pechora camp, which was labor and concentration camp where Jews were deported and forced to work and also were starved to the death. And in the middle, you can see commemorative plate in the place of Pechora camp. So her family could escape from Pechora thanks to her father, who knew German language and could understand when next action will start and escape. So what we can learn from the exhibition, and actually also what we as researchers learned from our work on that exhibition and the research project. Of course, pre-war family history, because we asked always about the family background. We asked about parents, grandparents, how people lived, if they were religious or not, if they observed some holidays or not, which language they spoke publicly and at home, what holidays actually they knew, and so on. And we learned quite a bit about pre-Holocaust time, about 1920s and 1930s. Then the routes of deportations and killing sites. Still, we don't know all those routes. And time to time, still in archives, we find some remote villages which don't exist anymore, but existed during the Holocaust, where either ghetto was created for several weeks, or there was a killing site. And very interesting that some Jews and also some Roma mentioned that in certain locations they were gathered together. And it was something completely new what we learned from the testimonies. Everyday life in labor camps and ghettos. Again, topic which only recently started to be researched widely. And still about Ukraine, and not only Transnistria, but other occupied zones. We don't know much about everyday life, about how people struggled there, about how they helped each other, and how they made a decision to escape or didn't make that decision. The next, what we learned, ways of survival. self-rescue, and resistance. And it brought me to the conclusion, which actually I wrote in my PhD dissertation, that first of all, Jews and Roma relied on themselves and tried to resist or self-rescue themselves. And only after that, they searched for helping from outside, from non-Jews and non-Roma. And it leads us to next topic, help and rescue by local Ukrainians. But of course, talking about Ukrainians, we cannot say that all Ukrainians helped or all of them were Ukrainians. We talk about also Moldovans, also some Romanians, some local Germans, Volksdeutsche, some Poles, some Czechs, some Russians, and so on. I would generalize like help by non-Jews and non-Roma to Jews and Roma. And very interesting that each interview always consisted information about two aspects, rescue and collaboration. Interview could go anywhere. Sometimes we had interviews for 6 hours in several days. And sometimes I returned to some survivors just to clarify some questions. And each time they emphasized again and again collaboration and rescue. And then the last, what I would say, denunciation by local Ukrainian collaborators. And again, when we say Ukrainian collaborators, I mean not only Ukrainians by ethnic origin, but the same Russians, the same Moldovans, the same Poles, and the same Volksdeutsche. And here it's important to see the balance, because in recent historiography, we can see that all Ukrainians are collaborators, but if we talk about rescue, that there are different ethnic origin who rescued. But I would again emphasize and stress that both rescuers and collaborators were not only Ukrainians, but others, but also mainly, of course, Ukrainians, because they resided in the territory of Ukraine and were ethnic Ukrainians. Some specification of talking. The Jews usually spoke to us one-to-one. It was looked more like proper interview. And actually, I took this frame and this methodology for my other interviews, which I collected several years later for my different research projects, including my dissertation. For Roma, and again, I myself came from Jewish background, and I pretty much knew which questions to ask about, for example, religion, about style of life, about the family. And in this regard, the Jews looked at me as own, because I'm also Jewish, and they could tell me as if I am their granddaughter many things. On the other hand, with the Roma, I didn't have any experience and any background. I didn't know much. I mean, I started to learn and read only when we started that project. And we never could enter the Romani house by our own. Always our team member Zemfira Kondur called and organized our interviews. And then we entered there, and usually there was nothing like in Jewish home, like one by one talking. Always there was a group of people with grandchildren who wanted to learn, and we realized that actually in Romani communities there is not so much conversations to outsiders about what they survived, but inside of families they talk quite a bit about that. And you see this pictures actually this grandson of those two Romani women who always was present during our conversations, listened, and actually the narration was not for us, but for him. Of course, some Of course, some materials were not included into the exhibition. For example, you can see here Riva Molochkovetsky. We have the one chart about her, a person who survived in Žmerinka, which I talked about just recently, the ghetto, where all Jews were preserved during 3 years of the occupation, except about 100 of Jews who escaped from another area and were given away to the hands of Germans. But all others actually were preserved there, and Riva also escaped to Žmerinka with her 2 younger sisters and mother after their grandmother was shot in Vinnytsia by the Germans. Actually, with her, I walked in Vinnytsia, where she showed me all buildings and streets, and then we traveled to Žmerinka, which is about 2 hours of travel by car, 1.5 hours by car. And in Žmerinka, she also could show me many things. For example, you see the photograph. This is the synagogue, pre-war synagogue, which in 2012, I think we made this trip 2012, already after the project was finished. She showed me the synagogue, and I see it's like normal house where people live. And I approached, there was a woman who just hanged linen outside, and I approached that woman and asked her if she knows something about the building. And the woman looked at me as if I'm crazy and said, what I have to know about this building? So people were even not aware about the synagogue. And even during the Holocaust, of course, synagogue didn't serve, but it was kept clean. And Riva herself, she was like 13, 14, 15 years old at that time. She herself, together with other teenagers, cleaned the synagogue regularly, even though it was empty. And so many such photographs I have, like former buildings with Judenrat and Jewish police, and some other administrative buildings, Romanian and German. And also we took interviews from the people who survived in different locations. And we couldn't actually create any charts about them because the exhibition is not limitless. We had to have certain amount, certain quantity of the charts, and also it was about timing, because it took us really a lot of time not to collect materials, but actually to work on them, to edit them, to excerpt the major parts mostly emphasized by the survivors. And here you see the example. Actually, first time I showed this. I mean, never ever I showed those pictures. On the left, Serafima Muzikus, who survived the Holocaust as Ostarbeiter. And she was brought for like forced labor to Germany, and still survived. And another one on the right, Nadia or Nadezhda Ruda, who actually testified about the massacre of Roma in Kamenets-Podilsky, the area where scholars consider that Roma communities were not killed, only isolated Roma. And I have her testimony that actually the community was killed, and she could save herself. In the beginning, like mother saved her in the kiln, and they just escaped the area. Now I would like to move to the last part, actually my research and how it's related to the exhibition. And as I said already, I would like to emphasize self-help and self-rescue, which came first before asking for help from outsiders, non-Jews and non-Roma. And of course, first it was escape. Just escape from the ghettos, from labor camps, from killing sites. Then another one was construction of hidden places. And actually in Transnistria, the Jews constructed own, how they called, secrets, where families, several families and friends could be hidden, and they hid themselves during their killing actions. And of course, generally hiding is a very important part of self-rescue. And particularly in Transnistria, there was one way to survive. Many Jews escaped, and actually Roma as well, escaped from the German-occupied zone, mostly Reichskommissariat, Ukraine, to Transnistria. Because in Transnistria, in certain way, to survive was easier, because Romanians accepted bribes. And by bribing, people could just release themselves and their relatives from prisons and even from killings. Talking about generally the Holocaust in Transnistria, there were some particularities. On the one hand, as I said, it was easier to survive, and we see the number of survivors actually in some areas really raises to 50%, which is impossible, for example, for District Galician or military administrative zone, whereas the percentage for surviving was like 10, 20. And in some locations in Transnistria, it was also 20, but in some even up to 50. And it was connected to the attitude of Romanians, like milder attitude, like all survivors, Romanian Jews said. But on the other hand, there was another genocide that was persecution by starvation, by sicknesses, when a person was sick and then spread the sickness, illness among others, like typhus, and never received any help. And moreover, Romanians just collected others, closed them, and all people eventually died. Then during the deportations, also those who couldn't walk were just killed or drowned in rivers. And this another side of the genocide, not only killing, and of course killings also existed, like in Domanivka and Bogdanivka, but this is another side of the genocide, not only killings, not only Holocaust by bullets, but through deportations, constant deportations from one place to another, then again movement, then again returning, and everything by food. And sometimes also people just died out of frost, that in autumn or winter it was impossible to walk in light clothes or without even shoes. And some locals also contributed to that, just stealing everything what was possible to steal. For example, Sergei Sushon mentioned how in front of his own eyes, someone during the deportation, someone fell, and immediately Ukrainian collaborator arrived, cut the finger where he saw the ring, just to take the ring. And we couldn't say anything. Again, Ukrainian, I mean, he could really say that it was Ukrainian because also this person spoke in Ukrainian, but not only Ukrainians did that. On the other hand, another testimonies told us, for example, from Roma, and also the same Sergei Sushon told, like other Ukrainians gave shoes when they saw that person is barefoot. And here we also come to another issue, help and rescue. And one of the major issues, paid and unpaid help. Sometimes for helping, even with shoes, Ukrainians or others, non-Jews, just asked money or something valuable, like let's say clothes or jacket. And after that, they could give some loaf of bread or some other food, or even water. And this paid help was quite spread. And here we also have to consider different states of the population, in also material state, that not everyone could help for free. But what is important is to stress that sometimes people just in this way, non-Jewish people in this way, just wanted to become richer or wanted to gain something. And particularly it was very spread with the Roma, because Roma couldn't even resist. And if the Jews were in the crowd, they could somehow escape and could be hidden in the crowd. Roma usually were on their own, and if someone wanted to rob them, it just happened. Also, at the same time, there was unpaid help, real help, which sometimes friends, sometimes relatives, but in very many cases, just random people tried to provide to Roma and to Jews as well. And recently I found several cases of tiny Ukrainian villages, exactly Ukrainian, which actually helped Jews to survive, because Jews were gathered into ghetto, like 7 kilometers from the village. And the villagers in turn went there to give bread and other food to the Jews. And they did it not only in summertime, but also in wintertime. And they had to prepare for that, to have sledges, to have horse, also to bribe polizei, Ukrainian policemen who guarded that ghetto. And they did it absolutely unpaid, with their own food which they had, and also even without knowing the Jews in the ghetto. And not only Ukrainians did it. For example, Semyon Dodek testified about local Volksdeutsche, German, who warned his family about upcoming Aktion, and for the first time, family could escape. But unfortunately, the second time, family decided to stay in the place, and only Semyon escaped on his own. But regularly, the Volksdeutsche warned Jewish families about upcoming Aktionen. So here I come almost to the conclusion, like pre-last my slide, about factors which influence the decision to collaborate with the occupiers and also to help victims. And all those factors were exactly the same. Regional factors depends in which particular region, even in Transnistria, Jews and Roma were gathered. If, for example, in the case of Žmerinka, Jews, all Jews were saved. But for example, in Sharhorod, Jews also could get some help from the Red Cross. But in some other places, tiny places like Ochakiv, for example, or others, they couldn't get any help. And for collaborators also there was regional factor, because in bigger cities or towns, local collaborators wanted to serve well, for to show themselves well in front of the occupiers, Romanian, and in the German, under the German occupations, in front of the Germans, and get more money or status, or just feeling to be safe. Punishment for help. In Transnistria, it was very easy to help, because among all occupied territories of Ukraine, only in Transnistria, there was not official punishment by death. And the court cases which I could find, of course, they were not just. I mean, we don't talk about justice here, but still there were court cases, not just pure shooting like in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. And I found in the newspapers several cases where people who helped the Jews were just fined. I mean, it was really a huge fine, but it was just money, not shooting. Or in some other cases, servitude works for 3 years, but again, not immediate shooting. Material state also very much influenced helping and also collaborating, because In some cases, collaborators just wanted to gain property, occupied empty spaces, like it was in Odessa city when the Jews were taking to the ghetto in Slobodka and then to deportations, and still they were collecting their clothes when Ukrainians or Russians immediately entered their flats and started just to plunder or occupy flats for themselves. And also for helpers, material situation was important because not all of them could, especially in cities conditions, could go and buy food without notice of others or just spending more money. Emotional state, again, is very important. And from my own research, I see that majority of helpers were relatives or friends, and less were just strangers. And emotional state also was important when we consider helping children, because in most cases helping children occurred more willingly and more frequently than helping to adults. And the same about collaborators. Sometimes just angry Ukrainian policy could shoot a person whom he wouldn't shoot under other conditions, just because of emotional situation. And it brings us also to the conclusion that we have to spend more time for researching emotions and feelings in particular case studies and situations. And as I said, familiarity with the victims, which also connected to emotional state, was very important and considered, because at the same time, the same collaborator who could shoot others could also save family whom he knew. That's why I placed here some sort of scale that collaboration and rescuing should be considered in balancing way, without exaggerating rescuing, and we don't talk about overwhelming rescue, but also we don't talk about, or at least we should not talk about only collaborators among Ukrainian population. And as a conclusion, I would just like to stress that we need more extensive research on the area. And even in Transnistria, where last 10-15 years research is really booming, still when we're going to the details, we cannot see many important issues, like, as I mentioned before, everyday life relations, or relations between local population and the Jews in particular cases, in particular areas, or, for example, interaction between the Roma and the Jews. Then we're moving to an interdisciplinary research, because of course, deepening research, we need to see how we can connect to other disciplines like history and anthropology, or ethnography in case of Roma, or history and geography in case of researching deportation step by step in Transnistria. And I hope that our research and the exhibition, which maybe some of you will visit, will also bring you to the, not conclusion, but to thinking about what we can learn today. And here I cannot just be silent, and I would like to mention the current situation in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And I don't compare the Holocaust and what's going on in Ukraine, but in terms of atrocities and violence, which we can observe on the Russian side towards Ukrainians, we can see that really lack of research of the Holocaust can bring us horrible days today. And as we know, in Ukraine and moreover in Russia, the Holocaust studies almost doesn't exist, even today, despite of several organizations, particularly in Ukraine, still it's not so much developed and deepened. And I hope it will change, it will be changed in the future. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hanna. If you don't mind just unsharing the screen. So we thank you so much. That was an incredible talk. And you know, I'm always struck by how little, how little I know. I mean, no matter how, it seems like no matter how many names of killing sites and labor camps and death camps, there's always so many that that I wasn't aware of. But I see that we have questions. So I'll just go in the order of my screen. And Dan, if you can unmute I think it's probably okay to unmute everybody at this point.
Yes, I did. I gave the controls out.
Thank you. So I see Wolf Grunner, Dr. Wolf Grunner has a question from the Dordtzev Genocide Research Center. Wolf?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that I'm the first because unfortunately I have to leave soon. So thank you for this really great talk. And I really appreciated that you talked about paid and unpaid help in a different way than we often kind of hear this, because kind of paid help is often blamed as extortion. And I think you made a really important point to emphasize that the conditions of families often were poor. And this is true for many regions. And so they just could not help without actually asking for money. And I think this is often overlooked, especially if they have to help more than one person. So I think that's a really important consideration. My question is, and I was a little bit struck when you did your conclusion, because I hope you can say something, and it's not just for the future of research, because you mentioned in the conclusion relationships between the Roma and the Jews, and I was really interested in what can you, what did your interviews and your research yield, because you separated both, like the Jews and the Roma, and you even emphasized that the Romas were on their own. Were there any relationships? Were there any effort to help each other? Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, shall I answer, or we collect the questions?
Oh, no, please feel free to answer as we go. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Wolf, for the question. Yeah, and here we come actually to my dissertation and my future book, where in fact I found several cases of helping Roma to Jews. I mean, because of understandable reasons, Jews couldn't help really Roma, because Jews were in the beginning and first killed and sent to the camps and ghettos. But the Roma also, we could see from the numbers that more Roma could survive, particularly in Transnistria. And there were instances exactly in Transnistria where Roma helped the Jews by hiding the Jews, and for several days and also several weeks, by providing the food. And yeah, and also like indirect, I mean, it's not really help by Roma, but sometimes I found at least 2 testimonies that Jews pretended to be Roma, not to be killed. This is very interesting. Yeah. Really? And again, the testimonies which I found, I think, no, they were published. Yeah, they were published in, I think, in Russian many years ago, very like 100 copies book, and collected from several people who were kids by the time. And there were 2, as I remember now, one the case was in the Rice Commissariat of Ukraine, not in Transnistria, and the boy was 15 years old, and he tried to walk with his sister and pretended that he is Roma. And another one also, another one I think in Transnistria, I don't want to make it up now, but I tell you that it exists like indirectly. And also actually from the Shoah Foundation, I found amazing interview of the connection between the Roma and the Jews before the Holocaust. And as a result, then Roma helped the Jews during the Holocaust. Because at the time of helping, Roma were not touched yet. But then, how they say themselves, our turn came and we couldn't anymore help the Jews, we had to run ourselves. And that was very interesting case, I think from Kakhovka, it's Rice Commissariat, Ukraine. Yeah. And I can tell more, but I also don't want to disclose many things from my book.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Wolf. And now we have Dr. Elka Sibilla, who's the director of the Holocaust Center at Kingsborough College in Brooklyn, with a very substantial Ukrainian population.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you so much. You can hear me, right? Yeah, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. So I just wanted to say something about, so there's a couple of my students here too who were, who came. So one of the things that I show my students is the hidden sorrows, the persecution of Romanian gypsies during the Holocaust by Michelle Kelso. I'm sure that you're familiar with her. She followed, I'd say maybe 10 to 12 survivors who are really living in very different situations than the people seemingly who you interviewed. For example, I would say that if they were in Romania, they had all been in Transnistria. They had described the horrors that they experienced there, from being starved, eating each other, just absolutely the most horrendous stories. They also described how they worked side by side with the Jewish population. Now, Michelle Kelso also follows them as they're trying to get restitution, try to get compensation from Switzerland and from Germany. We're talking here about $250 per country, right? And they need to produce all sorts of paperwork that they simply don't have anymore. We're talking here about, this is like late 90s, early 2000s. These people, most of these people are on their deathbed. There's people who are actually, they want to have this money because then at least their family can bury them. This is how poor they are. So one of the things that struck me, and this is kind of like my question, I think that it kind of follows what Dr. Gruner was saying, is that in a way, you would say that Transnistria was quite a distinct, unique Holocaust experience. You know, it was really quite different from other places. It's also a place where so many Roma have been killed. I was just wondering if you can say something about the shared experience of suffering, because the two largest groups, the groups were Jews and Roma. And I was just wondering, because when I saw how alone the Roma in Romania were in terms of, there was no advocates for them, there was no one fighting on their behalf, even though these two groups of people had been suffering side by side. They couldn't count on the larger Holocaust kind of like survivor network that has been established, that has helped so many of the survivors get restitution. And it seemed that the poorest of the poor were just left to their own devices. Sybil Milton has written about this quite extensively. But I was just wondering, have you come across any kind of more collaborations, or at least advocacy, cross kind of like advocacy, so that the survivors of Transnistria as a geographic location, that they were working together, get this acknowledgement, getting the kind of, the recognition as victims / survivors? Have you come across any of that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Elke. And I see here several questions. First of all, I should point out that I never researched compensations and the issues connected with it. But what I know that actually the situation with the Roma is really complicated just because many of them didn't have any documents. And also they started to change their nationality in their passports already before the war, when the Great Terror started in 37, 38. Some Roma started to ask authorities, bribe authorities that in the certificate of birth and passports, they would be written as Ukrainians or Moldovans or Russians. And after that, they always knew that they are Roma and they lived a Romani life. And when the Romanians or Germans arrived, they also persecuted them as Roma. But they cannot prove it because in their documents it's not written that they're Roma. It's one thing. Second, some of them even didn't have any documents. For example, later for my research, I interviewed another Roma in Moldova, in Soroka. And it was 2015, I think. She showed me passport from the USSR. She still used that passport. And also, actually, she raised that question of the compensations, that their town received the compensation. But this Roma community works a little different than with the Jews. Actually, the head of the community collects the money and then distributes, at least what I was told in at least two places, in Moldova, in Soroka, and in Ukraine and Ismail. And to control it is very difficult. I mean, sometimes, as I understood, the head of the communities don't give the money, but bring food, maybe several times, or clothes. So there are different relationships within the community. And because the Romani society is very closed, they don't want also to publicly to speak about it. And also because of stereotypes in the society. I mean, whatever they say, in Ukraine at least, everything turns against the Roma. If they get any money, then it will turn in some newspaper, so Roma robbed someone. And it's regular, all those stereotypes exist, unfortunately, and they don't disappear. And about Transnistria as a unique place, yes, it's sort of unique because if we take generally the Ukrainian territories, actually only in Transnistria, as I said, such quantity of the victims could survive. And also Roma, one of the things, the issues about the Roma in Transnistria, that there were mostly semi-nomadic, but also some nomadic Roma, to be clear. The stereotype about nomadic Roma is just a stereotype. Already in the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, at least half of the Roma in Ukraine was sedentary. And another half in 30s were semi-nomadic, means that they traveled in certain areas only in warm seasons, but not in cold seasons. They rented huts or flats, or sometimes even had their own, and they lived this way. And only several really nomadic families existed who circulated entire year. Actually, I know only about several Kelderash between Poland and Ukraine. But in that area, at least several families in Transnistria area, several families of Bessarabia and Roma or Kishinyovce also were nomadic. Many families were semi-nomadic. What does it mean? It means they knew areas very well and they could escape. And they could change the location when they heard only rumors about killing. And because, again, stereotypes and persecution of the Roma on constant basis, if they heard that the Jews are killed somewhere, they were prepared to escape. They were prepared to move. And in terms of the knowledge and awareness about the persecution, it was spread very fast among Roma, because all the time someone tells and sends message to another one, and because of this movements traveling all the time, they really know what's going on in the world. They didn't need to read newspapers or I don't know, to read some notifications from the Romanians or Germans. So they were aware of what's going on. And again, knowledge of the area and usage to the conditions of such, I would say, wildlife help them to survive. But it can be proved, because sedentary Roma were killed as the Jews, and in Transnistria, I don't know such cases, but for example, in District Galicia, and I have documents where several families, sedentary Romani families, just were killed in one day in 1943. And they exactly behavior was the same like Jewish. So Transnistria was unique because by bribing Romanians, and they willingly accepted bribes, people could survive. Bribing to Germans, bribing of Germans also existed, but to much least extent. And after that, also other like German hierarchy somehow learned, chiefs learned about this bribing. There were certain cases again in District Galicia. And in Transnistria, nothing happened like that. I mean, Romanians just accepted bribes and left until the next time they could catch the family of Roma, or even the Jews as well. Shared suffering, yes. What is interesting, when I collected interviews from the Jews, they never mentioned the Roma, but upon the question if Roma also suffered or were persecuted, they said, yeah, I remember there was such. Usually they talked like from very distant way about the Roma, and also mentioned it, just not clarifying what happened to them. We saw the Roma just moved by, but that they were deported. There was no emphasis that they were deported. There was no question if they were deported. Or some Roma families arrived during the Holocaust. They stayed a little bit near our town or village, and then they left. And to where they left, so they couldn't live on their own. They couldn't freely travel. But when talking to Roma, the first what they say that we suffered and the Jews suffered, or the Jews were killed the same as we were killed, all the time without any questions. They always raise this understanding of common suffering and common survival as well. And getting acknowledgement. Last years, as I know, there were more commemorations in Transnistria within Romani communities. But again, I didn't research that question, but as far as I know from other researchers, there was, at least in Odessa and in Mykolaiv and in Ismail, there was not common commemoration. But it doesn't mean that somewhere else it didn't exist. Probably it happened, and again, by spreading of knowledge about the Holocaust, of course, more and more Jews learn what happened, and then they arrive for commemoration. And Roma, I wouldn't say that they learn more, because again, closed society, they don't want to reveal their suffering. Mostly they talk within the family. I had such case again in Ismail when I tried to get interview from one survivor, and he spoke like very short, like as if nothing happened. And then his son said, "What's going on? You told us so many things about deportations." It's just they don't want really to talk to strangers. that's why I emphasized interdisciplinary research, because if one lives in the community for several months, already it becomes easier to understand what happened. And yeah, also, for example, a very interesting case in Odessa, it was only the place, and I believe still only the place in Ukraine, where the commemorative plates, actually monuments dedicated to the Holocaust, Jewish Holocaust, and dedicated to the persecution of Roma were erected at the same time in the same area, and only in Odessa. Of course, Baben Yar in Kiev also became such place, but I mean, yeah, in Odessa it was already in 2009, I think, or 8. The government dedicated certain space like Valley of Righteous, and 2 monuments were placed there, one for Roma, one for the Jews. It's what I know. Yeah.
Thank you so.
Just to it. I'm sorry, Lauren, just to it. Yeah, about Michelle.
Thank you so much.
Actually, now we prepare the book about deportations of Roma to Transnistria, where Michelle also is a contributor, and some others. And we try to make this book interdisciplinary. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I know we there are so many, there are so many issues and things to think through, and you have been amazing in really answering people's questions with such depth. But I know, especially for Hanna, it's now close to 2 a.m. And I want to thank you so sincerely for this incredibly interesting, moving, and informative talk. And I want to thank all of you who were on tonight, and to please to thank very much Dr. Sibylla's students for joining us, and to please let people know about the exhibition. It will be up for a month. It will be up on our campus until April 10th. All are welcome. And Dr. Abakunova showed a few of the what are you calling them, charts? But there are many of them filled with individual stories, both of Roma and of Jewish people and Jews, and maps and all kinds of, it's really a wealth of information. And thank you so much to all of you. And thank you so much, Hanna. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add that I saw one more hand from Andrew, and if it's okay, I can take one more question, and if it's fine with you, or
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hanna. I was just applauding you. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Somebody please has their microphone on. Please shut it, because it's hearing it. Okay.
Hanna, thank you so much for your presentation. I was just giving you applause. I didn't have a question, but it was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much again for organization of all these events, exhibitions, and it's really important, I think, I'm very, very happy that this exhibition has new life after so many years.
Yeah,
Thanks
absolutely. We are too. Thank you. And thanks to everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you for your questions and your attendance. We hope we'll see you on our campus for the exhibition.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. I'm gonna end the recording.